Hi, this is Dominic Loise with the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum. Today on the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum's virtual session, we'll be speaking with Steve Darnall of Those Were the Days, Old Time Radio, and we'll be talking not only about Ray Bradbury's influence with his short stories on old time radio, but also how he was influenced by old time radio. So just sit back and relax, and we'll be with you with another virtual session. Okay, so we're recording, we're back, and I have Steve Darnall from Those Are the Days, and Those Were the Days. And do you want to give a little bit introduction of yourself and all the projects that you're involved with?
Sure, thank you, Dominic. Yeah, I am the host of Those Were the Days, which is a radio show dedicated to the golden age of radio. Heard every Saturday afternoon here in the Chicago area on WDCB. I'm the publisher of Nostalgia Digest, which is a quarterly magazine that covers similar terrain regarding the golden age of entertainment. I'm also a longtime fan of and sometimes writer of comic books. And so I'm probably as familiar with Ray Bradbury's work, was introduced to it through that medium as much as any other.
Well, great. So what was your first introduction to Ray Bradbury?
Boy, I'm thinking my first time reading the work of Ray Bradbury would have been around fifth grade when there was some textbook had excerpted Dandelion Wine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just lovely writing. And I'm sure at the time I was impressed by it. And of course, as these things go, that's fairly atypical for what we think of when we think of Ray Bradbury. But it was just so beautifully written. And I'm remembering specifically the passage where the young boy negotiates getting a pair of tennis shoes. And you know, even now, I remember actually when Ray passed away in 2012, I read that excerpt from Dandelion Wine on Those Were the Days. And, you know, really, it meant a lot to me. And at the time, I was really all the more impressed with just how lyrical Ray Bradbury's writing was. And then over time, I discovered that he'd written stories that had been adapted for radio and for comic books, and you know, just a tremendous and clearly very prolific writer.
Now, you yourself, have you ever been up to Waukegan to see the area where his boyhood home was?
I've been up to Waukegan. I can't say I've been there as a tourist.
Okay.
And I really should, because it's a tremendous city. And of course, I know Ray Bradbury came from there. I know that Jack Benny grew up there. And between those two, you'd think everybody
right in your wheelhouse.
No, the closest I've been is backstage at the Genesee Theater, where they actually have saved the script from a radio show that Jack Benny did there. No, I've not been up to Waukegan to see Ray Bradbury's boyhood. I'd love to. Maybe once it's... Is it someplace one can drive by? Because I have a feeling that's probably the only way we're going to get to see anything these days.
Well, they actually have the Waukegan Walk, where you can. They've reprinted his boyhood map of all his favorite haunts.
Oh, marvelous!
They actually have the signs up for the Ray Bradbury walking tour to take in Waukegan now.
That is perfect on so many levels. Yeah.
So that leads me into Ray Bradbury and old time radio. So when he was writing for the Blue and White Daily for the high school paper, he actually wrote an article about Jack Benny and how he was from the same hometown of Jack Benny. So that shadow of old time radio was always, you know, in his bones, one could say. Can you tell us a little bit about, let's start off with Jack Benny first and Waukegan.
Sure. Well, and you and I were talking about this before we started recording. One of the things that I've really learned to love about Ray Bradbury is that he was of that generation of writers who understood that there was as much value to be absorbed in, quote, low culture as in high. You know, I'm sure he could have, I know he had an appreciation for the work of storytellers like Dickens and Shakespeare and the masters. But yes, the fact that he was also a fan of radio, the fact that he was a fan of comic strips, because he understood the potential of all those things. But yes, Jack Benny, my gosh, what can we say? Jack Benny was the gold standard of radio comedy in the 1930s and 40s and even into the 1950s. And even though he was, in fact, born in Chicago, he grew up in Waukegan as Benjamin Kobelsky, and always made mention of Waukegan as his hometown when he was on radio or television.
Yeah, you know, we can do a whole program on Jack Benny in itself.
Yes.
But, you know, those familiar with Jack Benny's name in Waukegan is up on as many things as Ray Bradbury now.
Which I think is great, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So young Ray, when he was 12, found out that KGAR radio was just 2 blocks away from his house, and kind of finagled to get a job reading old-time comics, you know, the Sunday funnies at that time. Now, the Sunday funnies was a little bit different than they are now. Mm-hmm. Can you tell our viewers kind of what people would expect in the Sunday funnies as opposed to if you were to open the Sunday page today?
Well, I suppose the immediate distinction between the Sunday comics of old and the current day is they were much larger.
Yeah.
This is when newspapers would have obviously entire sections devoted specifically to full color comics, but I think for the most part they were tabloid size, and of course in many cases I think a Sunday strip could take up to a full page in some cases. Yeah. I'm thinking of the Hal Foster Prince Valiant, for instance, or things like that. And one of the things, of course, too, that distinguished the comic strips of old from those of today is that there was a much greater emphasis on serialized storytelling. Nowadays, of course, and you know, some great people working in comics like Patrick McDonnell and Trudeau and all those folks, but the overriding convention of comics today is that it tends to be a gag strip. Either it's 3 panels and a punchline, or it's a single image. Whereas in those days, I mean, you would have people like Hal Foster doing Prince Valiant, you have people like Alex Raymond doing Flash Gordon or Jungle Jim. Of course, you know, Little Orphan Annie by Harold Gray. And you know, you'd have an enormous amount of space devoted to a single strip telling a story, the express purpose of which was to get you to come back the following day and the following week to continue reading the newspaper. So that's probably the biggest distinction. Certainly it wasn't uncommon during the golden age of radio for stations, mostly local stations, I don't know of too many network broadcasts like that, but to have someone on hand to read out the comic strips. And usually it would be a show sponsored by a newspaper syndicate like the Hearst Company.
Yeah.
I know Lon Clark, who was radio's Nick Carter, did something back in New York called the Comic Weekly Man. And in all of these cases, they would usually find someone who could do multiple voices, and of course, and then describe what was going on in the panels, so that, you know, if you were Ray Bradbury or Lon Clark reading Prince Valiant, you know, you'd have the scene where with the prince, you'd have the scene with the king. If it was Flash Gordon, yes, someone would have to be Flash, somebody would have to be Dr. Zarkov. Usually they'd want it to be the same guy. You'd need someone who had that level of versatility. And of course, the most famous example is when Fiore LaGuardia did it, but I don't think he's necessarily the gold standard for vocal versatility. I've never heard Ray Bradbury do it, although that is a perfect idea. And
Yeah.
it does bring up something that is most unfortunate when we look back at this era, Dominic, is that local radio stations in particular were not very good at keeping permanent records of what they broadcast. And that's really heartbreaking. I mean, I would love to think somewhere in the world there's a recording of 12-year-old Ray Bradbury reading the funnies. But probably KGAR wasn't going to spring to record that, and certainly there were no advertisers to appease, so it's an unfortunate casualty. But it says so much about Ray Bradbury, both in terms of his boyhood ambition and his deep abiding affection for pop culture.
And it's also amazing that he bookended his career, that later on he went on to work on the screenplay for the Little Nemo in Slumberland movie. That, that this is something from, the beginning ages. He was reading, would he have been possibly reading the Little Nemo story, and then to go on and work on this. One can only wonder.
And as I recall, there's also a story I think Ray Bradbury told about when he was young. He had actually cut some of these strips out of the paper and pasted them in a scrapbook, and then I think once adolescence kicked in, he decided it was too childish or something like that, and he regretted it ever since. And in a way, again, talk about being a visionary. The idea that, someone would want to preserve Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. And now, of course, there are entire companies whose entire reason for existing is to reprint comic strips from the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Yeah. So, I mean, and just so everyone watching this knows, it doesn't stop with Ray at 12 reading the funnies. He would hang out, and, his first writing gig was writing for the George Burns and Gracie Allen show. He had, we can talk about how he had finagled himself, because in the beginning, before they had audiences, they wouldn't have audiences in old time radio to watch these broadcasts.
That's true. They either in the very early days of radio comedy, and then we're talking about the early 30s at this point, they either didn't have a studio audience, which of course drove a lot of performers crazy, because what comedian doesn't want to play off of an audience, particularly the ones that came out of vaudeville, as George Burns and Jack Benny did. Or they had an audience who were told, do not laugh or applaud, which would drive a comedian even crazier. Because, and sometimes, I mean, they've talked about having glass panels between the audience and the performers so that noise wasn't picked up. And I think the overriding concerns were, at the time, they weren't 100% sure that the equipment could handle the laughter of 400 people. And I think they were also afraid that it would prove distracting to listeners at home, which in retrospect seems terribly naive. But yes, it wasn't. I've heard some of the early recordings of people like Jack Benny, and without a studio audience, it's a little distracting. And I'm sure it was for the performers too. But yes, it's and I recall reading that years later, Ray Bradbury was in Hollywood at some meeting and mentioned that he'd slipped a few jokes to George Burns when Ray was a teenager, right? Or even if that.
Yeah.
And apparently George came up afterwards and said, "Was that you? I remember you." And it's like, wow, that and that says a lot too about that time, the fact that a teenage Ray Bradbury, who had yet to establish himself as a writer, was able to accost one half of one of the biggest comedy teams in the land. And just slip some jokes to him in an envelope, and sort of no one was thinking about, boy, if you use these, I'll have to sue you. If, why is someone approaching me? Do I need to call security? It was a very different time in a lot of respects, and that's one of them. I mean, talk about great ways to get your foot in the door. Yeah,
Jack Benny used to always have the joke, if a joke bomb, that he would say that's from the kids in the hall that would throw him jokes.
That's right.
Like that, and that's how the Canadian troupe grabbed their name, from the kids in the hall.
That's right.
So now, not only did Ray just have this love of the old performers, and when he moved from Waukegan to California, they was hanging not only around the studios and the Brown Derby and these radio stations and stuff, to the point where he even got barred from the studios because there was the gossip show, the gossip maven, who had him running odd errands, that he was using he ended up using her limousine to drive around for the Hollywood Hotel.
Oh my God, yes, Luella Parsons.
Luella Parsons, yes.
Oh my God, and
But
Luella
she barred
Parsons.
him, and then he ended up dumpster diving after that for scripts. So this collecting and just this pack ratness to just have any sense of it.
And Luella Parsons could be a real terror, from what I understand. She was, for those who don't know, she was the chief movie columnist for the Hearst newspaper syndicate. So she was in hundreds of newspapers across the country and had a tremendous level of power at a time when not many people in the industry, apart from the moguls, had that power. So she did this show, Hollywood Hotel, in the mid-30s, and for the most part was able to coerce big-name stars to appear on the show for free, which eventually the American Federation of Radio Artists was formed, and they put a stop to that. But there is a very famous story, and I think Lorene Tuttle, the radio actress, told it, about Luella Parsons on the phone with a rather recalcitrant Olivia de Havilland. And Lorene Tuttle said all she could hear was Luella Parsons saying, "Olivia, you come down here right now, or I'll tell 100 million people what a rotten actress you are." It's like, wow. You know, and it's interesting because they say the best stories come from real life. And I'm sure if Ray Bradbury had concentrated entirely on telling stories about things like that, he'd have been a great storyteller. But the fact that he went so far beyond that is really, you know, he's possibly the one exception to that, because even though he had a fascinating life.
Yeah, he had an even more fascinating imagination.
Indeed.
So speaking of his imagination, it's amazing that around the time that his career is taking off, that he's starting to get in past the pulps and in the, you know, the glossy magazines, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
And the radio in the 1950s starts picking him up now. We're talking about like Dimension X and Suspense and everything like that. So we see, not only is he in these Colliers and these more prominent magazines, but now he's playing in the theater of the mind on these radio shows.
And you will probably know the chronology better than I do, but I do know if it wasn't the first story he sold, it was certainly the first story he sold to radio. In 1947, Suspense, the radio show, did a production of one of his stories called "And So Died Ria Bushinska."
Yeah.
And again, I don't know where in his career chronology that falls, but I do know that Suspense in particular took a very keen interest in Ray Bradbury's writing before the world at large really, I think before he was a household name that he became. And certainly he was in the science fiction pulps, as you say, at a time when they were clearly starting to go beyond being the sort of space opera that we associate with shows like Buck Rogers or the Flash Gordon movies. And so with that wave, and especially in post-war America and the atomic age, when science was a dominant topic amongst every American, it made sense that radio would look for new ways to tell stories of the future. And some of them were utopian and some were dystopian. But I think Ray Bradbury's love of radio, I wouldn't presume to say how it influenced him as a writer, but it's clear listening to his stories adapted on the science fiction shows like Dimension X or X-1 that Ray Bradbury had an economical style of storytelling to the point where his works could be very easily adapted for a show that had to tell an entire story in 24 or 26 minutes. And that's to his enormous credit. And I think too, if I'm not mistaken, in some cases he was happy to assist in terms of script writers who wanted to figure out the best way to winnow down the Martian Chronicles to fit into half an hour.
Yeah. So he is, you know, a man of multiple platforms. And I want to thank you for coming and sharing some time with us as far as, as far as talking about this. Now, as far as your work goes and keeping old time radio on the airwaves, where can people watching this find Those Were the Days and find Nostalgia Digest?
Well, thank you for asking, because that's one I know the answer to for sure. Those Were the Days is heard every Saturday afternoon on WDCB here in the Chicago area. So if you're in Chicago or Waukegan, hopefully you can pick it up at 90.9 FM. If not, it will stream live every Saturday at wdcb.org. And if you want to hear past editions of Those Were the Days, you can do so at our website, nostalgiadigest.com. And forgive me, I don't usually bring visuals, but I just happen to have this bookmark sitting here on my desk.
That's perfect.
That is where you can hear past editions of Those Were the Days. That's where you can learn about Nostalgia Digest magazine, which Dominic has been kind enough to mention. Again, it's a quarterly publication dedicated to the golden age of entertainment, but it also lists the schedule for our Those Were the Days program. In case, say, in October of 2020, you're curious to know, what are they planning for October 24th? Yes. This will tell you. And as it happens, I just happened to have brought one along. I swear, this was not planned. I have this left over from my library lectures. But it has been a real labor of love to get to put these things together. I always say that hosting a show like Those Were the Days, it's the equivalent of putting your baseball cards on the floor to make a team. And so you get to pull this right fielder from the 1980s and this center fielder from the 1940s, and wow, what a team this would be. And I'm so grateful for the chance to talk about Ray Bradbury's work in radio in particular, because clearly it meant a lot to him, and given all the stories that became a part of radio during that golden age, it's meant a lot to a lot of us as well, long after the fact.
And if also folks want to find out more about Waukegan's other prominent son, Jack Benny, there's a ton of books on the website too that about Jack Benny too that people can.
Yes, and in fact, I didn't bring this. I can't hold this up to the camera, but my predecessor at Those Were the Days, a man named Chuck Shaden, has done a 12-part audio documentary about the Jack Benny program. And he interviewed many of the principals from that show. Jack, of course, Phil Harris, Dennis Day, some of the writers like George Balzer and Milt Josephsberg, and put all that together into this 6-hour audio documentary. It's utterly wonderful. A lot of firsthand recollections of a golden age of radio, and that is also available at nostalgiadigest.com, as are a lot of recordings of Jack Benny on radio, and in fact, possibly some recordings of Ray Bradbury's story on the radio too.
Well, I want to thank you so much. You know, unlike the character of Jack Benny, you've been very generous.
Oh, Dominic, thank you. And I apologize to your viewers for the glare. You and I were working out a lighting plan beforehand, but we had to drop it. But I'm afraid I did look like I was from outer space earlier. But thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. And I'm very grateful have been asked. Thank you.
Yeah, and also, where can folks find your comic book work too?
Oh my, most of it's gone out of print.
Oh.
But as it happens, I had a chance to collaborate with my dear friend, an artist named Alex Ross, earlier this last year on a little Doctor Strange story for an anthology called simply Marvel, published by Marvel Comics. The first issue came out just before the pandemic in March, and I believe the remaining issues 2 through 6 will come out beginning in November of 2020. It is an anthology book, so a lot of really talented people are involved. And I had the pleasure of writing an interstitial framing story with Doctor Strange, so my first Marvel credit in about 25 years, but it's always a delight to work with Alex, and it's always a delight to work in that medium, because comics are like radio in that there's a very specific vocabulary, and there are things you can do there that would be impossible anywhere else. So in that respect, it's one of the reasons that I owe Ray Bradbury a lot.
Well, that is amazing. I want to thank you for being a part of the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum virtual sessions. And more can be found at the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum. And speaking of comics, if you're watching this in October, the Ray Bradbury Inktober event is still going on. So please check that out. So thank you. And please check out the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum for what we have going on. Thank you so much.